Okay, welcome back. I hope you managed to get a bit of lunch and so on. We better get on with our next talk. Great pleasure to welcome Dr. David Jeffries, who's had a long and distinguished career in clinical academic medicine and in medicines regulation. He's now Senior Vice President for ISI Europe, as it says on his slide. So David, thank you very much. You're going to talk about medicine development for multimorbidities.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Munir, and good afternoon to everybody. I must say, I thought this morning's session was absolutely fabulous. A lot of learnings there. What I'm going to try and do is be a bit of a segue into the breakout sessions to look at how some of the issues which I think we're facing in the pharmaceutical industry and how we are adapting to some of these changes and some things we can put on the table for further discussion later. The usual disclaimer slide. I always feel that what this enables a speaker to do is to give a bit more information and thoughts they would do otherwise, but just to make clear what I'm saying is really a personal reflection, and they don't necessarily represent the views of either ASI nor of the ABPI or some of the other groups I'm associated with. So what I thought we'd do on the next slide is just to define a little bit about the problem statement I think we're facing in the industry. I think, as you all know, increasingly medicines are being used for patients with multiple and with multiple conditions and with comorbidities. And of course, we are also seeing many more drugs being used in combination. Indeed, you could say that that's one of the problems at the present moment, just how many patients are on extensive combination therapies. I think we all know with the demography that we are treating many more of the frail elderly. And I think the data which was referred to earlier in terms of sarcopenia and some of the very frail elderly, we can see that from about the late 80s onwards, there is a different handling, a different metabolism of drugs with a significant step change in the pharmacokinetics of many drugs and also implications for the pharmacodynamics. So I think we recognize we're moving into a very different group of patients. And equally, what we're seeing now is treating a much more diverse group of patients and in very diverse settings. I want to pick up on some of that in a little bit later. So if we can move on to the next slide. Again, I think most of this is pretty obvious to all of you, but if we look what's going on in drug development, we're moving very much more now to targeted therapies with great benefits. I personally never really liked the term in the past, precision medicines. But I think we've now got those. We've moved beyond what I used to prefer, stratified medicines, to these precision medicines. But that does mean, both in terms of the pharmacology and the development, we've moved away from the small molecules, which had quite extensive secondary pharmacology. And sometimes that was a balancing secondary pharmacology. On other occasions, there were those other attributes of the drugs, which I think played into the treatment of multimorbidities. So to one extent, we have lost some of that. Also, of course, as part of this development, we now have much more targeted proof of concept studies, and that has inevitably led us to having much tighter inclusion and exclusion criteria. Great for patient safety, great for accelerating drug development, but actually may not give us the totality of the evidence which we've had in the past and which we may need in the future. So we just need to think about some of these trends which are moving against the fact that we're playing much more in the multimorbidity space and much more in the very frail members and vulnerable members of patients and of society. So if we move on to the next slide, if we may, I think what this does show is perhaps a significant potential mismatch of requirements and expectations. Expectations of society has of the industry and the requirements, but how we deliver those against a different set of requirements, which are for more precision medicines, more targeted therapies brought to the marketplace much more rapidly. And I think that's something which we'll look at least one of the breakout sessions this afternoon. So if we can move on. What have we been doing? Well, it's interestingly, quite a few of you on this call will remember in February 2020, we launched 2 task forces, and that was actually done, Janet will remember, in the University of Birmingham, when we introduced the task force around diversity in drug development with an initial focus on maternal health. At the same time, we launched the Multimorbidities Action Group. Inevitably, these have taken some time in the planning, but it's interesting that we launched those at the beginning of February. I was able to be at the meeting as RSC chair because I just had a meeting which would have overlapped in Malaysia, cancelled because of the impact of the COVID-19 epidemic at that stage, and how we all thought at that moment that yes, this might pose some threats to us in Europe, but would all be easily containable. How wrong we were in those early days of February when we were just chatting about this emerging issue, I recall, in Birmingham before that conference. Life has turned out very differently. So that's what we in industry have been doing. I just wanted to share that some of that is now on the table. Obviously, the COVID pandemic itself has perhaps both accentuated the need for these groups, but has also delayed us a little bit in what we would like to do just because of all the other pressures which have come. So if we move on to the next slide, just to share some thoughts with you. I think alongside all this, we've seen the work that ICH has been doing, that's the International Conference on Harmonisation, with more emphasis on PK and PD interaction studies. I think the UK has always been very good at these. I know, Munir, you were very much hot on these in the days of the CSM and on the Commission on Human Medicines in your new role, or not so new role. I think UK has been very hot on this. Others are catching up, but I think there is much more emphasis on PKD, on interactions and pharmacodynamic interactions as we treat the more elderly and multimorbidities. Very much the focus now in both ICH and led out of FDA is on patient-centered drug development, so-called, well, I don't really like the word, but patient centricity. But I think patient-centered drug development very much to the fore, asking those questions when we have a candidate molecule, what would patients like out of this? What characteristics would they like to see us develop? What's the target profile that patients would like to see? Then comes the question, how can we deliver that? I think we've been at this, and I very much recall this being taken forward under Sir Michael Rawlins when we looked at the elderly guideline. And I remember that phrase at the time, we're not looking to develop drugs for relatively fit 65 plus marathon running people. Not thinking at this stage that I would fall into that category as a marathon runner in there. But I think we are seeing now the emphasis, the need to really get many more patients in that frail elderly group into trials. And still to this day, if you look at trials of drugs recently approved, perhaps too few are including the frail elderly. We need to address this. We certainly, there's a drive for more inclusive trials, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But I think diversity in clinical trials is a key theme, and I think the COVID-19 pandemic has accentuated that. And then, of course, we shouldn't forget all the work going on in what I'll call digital medicine. And I think there we need to remember that when we're developing drugs for multimorbidities, there's a great need for more patient support, for more information to be given to them, for more prompts to encourage therapeutic compliance. And here I think the pandemic has actually helped us. Because I think what we're seeing now is so many more people are e-enabled. I know chairing a Healthy Wellbeing Board in London, just the greater number of people now who were excluded from the digital world in March of 2020, now through their grandchildren, sometimes their great-grandchildren. Surprising how many of them are now online. And actually, I think we now have a capacity to move that forward and to give more support. And of course, we've all seen the benefits of real-world data, again, through the pandemic. I think about here the Zoe app and others. And I think we're seeing here how that will carry forward for real-world evidence and real-world data. So let me move on. I think a key feature in when we're looking at multimorbidities, and indeed the COVID-19, long COVID syndrome, will be the repurposing of medicines. And I think that goes back to my earlier slide, looking where we have extensive secondary pharmacology. And I think there's been a great deal of work done to how we take this forward. ABPI has a position paper on this, but I think we can see here, and I think we had a couple of presentations this morning, which emphasize how we can look at other drugs playing into long COVID syndrome. And certainly what I think we in industry are trying to work with, and working with colleagues like Janet and many others, is trying to identify here those common drivers of morbidity. What are those inflammatory pathways? What are those other pathways which may be driving multiple morbidities? And I think we're getting some clues out of the pandemic to look again at other areas of disease, whether that's ME syndrome, a variety of others, just to start seeing what we're uncovering in terms of a common driver. I think that's going to be a key discussion, probably for one of the other groups we've got, looking down the list here. So just another few thoughts as I try and bring this together for us. If we look at the drug development paradigm, I think it's fair to say that most of the major agencies are going through re-evaluations and they're looking for the next 5 or 10 years. We've seen the PDUFA 7 program in the US with some really exciting elements to that. As part of this, we have a great emphasis in the US around MIDD, model-informed drug development, leading us forward. As I mentioned earlier, the FDA is strongly pushing and taking forward already into ICH patient-focused drug development. The EMA has its Regulatory Science Initiative program, which is really trying to encourage the collaboration in a whole variety of areas, particularly now looking, and I know ICMA is also looking at this, International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Agencies, how we can use artificial intelligence to further enhance our drug development, both in terms of targeting molecules, pulling them through, and cross-learnings. Similar discussions going on in Japan, and I think we will see some very good things coming now out of IMI as it moves into Europe to become the IHI, where it brings in diagnostics and also brings in medical technology. So I think we get some great work forward there under that new program at EU 27 level. MHRA, I think here, again, a lot of exciting things forward. I think only last Friday, we saw the proposals around the new medtech legislation, but particularly just like to call out ILAP, the Innovative Licensing Access Pathway. I think this is very exciting. It's created a lot of interest worldwide. But at its heart there, this has the idea of pull-through drug development, of regulators and industry working together. There needs to be appropriate separation as well, because one's the regulator, the other is the industry, but how we can help to co-create drugs. And I think we saw great examples of that and great benefits through the pandemic, when there were some unique partnerships which have benefited everybody. So in industry, we now have a regulatory repurposing group, which has been established at European level, which is taking forward to see how we can build around this in terms of taking not only just repurposing, but then going deep back into the mechanisms. So a more mechanistic approach, and that's moving forward. We have the Accumulus project, which is looking to move us from documents to data. How can we make a reality of rolling reviews? How can we share the data now more than just having large documents? How can we share data in real time and take that forward? And as I said at the outset, I think there's some really exciting things now moving ahead in a range of companies around using artificial intelligence to aid drug development and to better target our programs. And there's a lot of things which we ought to have learned from the past. It's sitting in all our libraries and we've not used it. I think this is a way to go back and to extract information and to carry us forward. Many of us have done this during COVID-19 when we did go back to our libraries, go back to our research and think, hey, what might help in this area? And several of those drugs have now been taken forward and some are in or on the platform studies. So that's been excellent. Just moving on then, conscious that we're coming towards the time now. Next slide for me. So how has COVID-19 influenced our thinking and our approach? How has it fed into this whole agenda around multimorbidities? So on the next slide, just a few thoughts to lead us in there. I think we recognize right at the outset, there were a number of what we call flexibilities. I think the WHO coined the term regulatory agilities, and does sound rather better. What did we need in the toolbox just to get us through the pandemic, to prevent the system falling over? It didn't. It was a very robust system, as we've now seen. But those were for the toolbox for a pandemic and maybe for a future pandemic. But equally, across the globe, we saw a lot of flexibilities brought in. And we're now able to test some of those and see what was beneficial, what should be carried forward to become the new norm. And there's a lot of work going on with that. Again, we've had those discussions between industry and ICMRA, and these are being highlighted literally as we speak today and over the next couple of days through the International Conference of Drug Regulatory Agencies, which is not in New Delhi. It's this year, as last year, it's being run virtually, but with a really great series of presentations looking at this. Decentralized trials, how they've moved on. I think we used to talk about 2 years ago, remote monitoring and its potential. We now call them the US term of decentralized trials. But here, what progress we've made around remote monitoring, which is better for patients, gives you better data and gives you faster data and reduces that space when you were cleansing the data and so on. And allied to that, we've seen remote delivery as well. I think that's very much here to stay, and that's been a great way forward. As I said earlier about real world evidence, and actually we've seen a number of pieces of work done in real time with unstructured data. How much have we learned out of analysing what's on Facebook to inform drug development rather than waiting for more formalised data sets? I mentioned the landscape for e-labelling and digital engagement, so I won't repeat that. I think the platform trials have played a major part here. How can we take that forward? And some of the work we're seeing around the clinical global trial collaboration, work that Martin Landry and others are doing, will also play into this space. And again, I think what we're seeing are greater use of accelerated pathways, that co-design, that pull-through development. So I think all of that now is getting pretty hard baked, or hope it is, into the system. And that, I think, will bring great benefits to us over the next few years. So if I can move on to the next slide as we move to a conclusion. The diversity agenda. I think this is an area of intense debate, intense discussion. I think at its heart, what we're all trying to do, isn't it, is to make clinical trial participation more open, more accessible. And there are a number of different diversities which play into this. I think we recognise that certain communities are disadvantaged. How do we make sure we do get more inclusivity into the trials? I think in addition, how do we make clinical trials a good experience for people or their families? Unfortunately, some of these are mortality studies. Therefore, how do we make sure that the families get information? And I think, again, we're in our company very much involved in the dementia space. How can we make those trials more meaningful such that members of the family, others hear about it, they want to sign up? I think that the COVID experience has taught a lot of people about medicines regulation, about clinical trials. I used to joke to people, nobody had heard of the MHRA, or before that the MCA. I think, Chairman, everybody now talks about the MHRA. They talk about randomized clinical trials, all the things we do, benefit, risk. That wouldn't have been in people's daily parlance 2 years ago. Now it is. And I think I'm right in saying many more people now are interested in participating, but how do we make that meaningful for them? And how do we make sure that we get more diverse groups involved? So I think part of this are the trial registers. How can we get people to register in advance if there's a family history there? How can we take forward randomization at the point of treatment, better use of physician best choice comparators, which I think arguably solve a lot of our problems with the global interface, how we have comparators, but actually are more relevant for physicians in their settings. So I think we'll hear a lot more about this. I know all companies are looking to take that forward, and ABPI is very much committed to this. And the initial work we're doing is around maternal health. How do we get more data so that women can receive appropriate therapies? It was too easy in the past to have that lovely pregnancy statement, contraindicated in pregnancy because there's no data. Now we need to move on and make sure we can get data, and also make sure we do have medications for certain conditions in pregnancy where it's desperately needed. So that certainly is one which I think has grown out of the COVID pandemic, or rather being given an enhancement through that. So the next slide, if I may. Long COVID syndrome. I've left this as a blank sheet deliberately, not to say we're not doing anything. I think the industry is doing a lot, but we're still very much learning here. And rather than preempt our discussions in the breakouts, I've left it blank. In fact, that was my old school motto, fill in the blank, or in Latin, alba exorna. So I've left this blank so we can fill that in during the rest of our presentation. So that, I think, brings me to the conclusion of our thoughts here. If I just have the next slide. It was interesting looking back there this quote which we all use. I discovered it came, in fact, from the Venerable Bede when I was in holiday in Northumbria back in August. That quote, "The more we diverge, the more we converge." And I think we are seeing that very much in this space. And it's interesting to see a number of things on the agenda today, which we saw perhaps 30 odd years ago coming back. So I think very much it is that question of what goes around comes around. But I think we've now got a new emphasis here, and there's very much a new imperative. So let me stop there, and hopefully that gives you just some thoughts. That's a little bit scattered, but will lead us into these excellent, which I'm sure will be excellent, breakout sessions. So thank you very much, Munir.
That's great. Thanks very much, David. That's very thought-provoking. So we've got Eddie's got his hand up. Eddie, first question.
Thanks, Mayor. Thanks, David. That was such a thought-provoking talk. It was great. And it actually raised my hand before you put up your final thought about what goes around comes around. As a virologist who was in industry when we started to talk about personalized medicine, precision medicine, etc., I always saw viral disease or infectious disease as a crucible of precision medicine, then translated to oncology and other therapeutic areas. So it struck me that with what you're saying about what's going on with COVID and what some of the other speakers have said about multidisciplinary teams, etc., is COVID and SARS-2 driving us back to the future where, again, the learnings from infectious disease will drive long-term outcomes or long-term changes in health management beyond infectious disease? So that's my question. And before I leave you to speak, David, my other thought is, you're talking about the common driver. To me, the common driver, quite obviously, is everyone's been infected with the SARS-CoV-2. So if we start there and think about what the virus is created in terms of a host response, that may be a way that we begin to start addressing longer COVID. So that's what I was thinking, David.
Well, thank you very much. And it's great to see you again on that. I think you're right. I think already what I'm picking up, I was on a call yesterday, in the dementia space, if you take out the terrible effects of isolation and everything else that happened, it does seem as if there may be some interaction there of the virus. And I know that may be giving us some clues there. I think if you look at some of the other systemic effects, what are they? What are these effects that COVID seems to have on suppressor T cells? I think we may find that either we learn there are interactions there, or as a result of our focus on it, we're going to learn a whole lot more. So I think this is going to it's such a multi-system disease. I think there are lots of clues coming out, and I'm sure you're right that we've probably said, oh, well, we'll just treat the virus without looking at some of those other drivers which are being exhibited. And I think we're seeing par excellence, aren't we? Going back to my days as a cardiologist, how many times as a cardiologist did you see that idiopathic cardiomyopathy? You assumed it was probably a viral reaction. The story was a bit like it. I think we're going to have a lot more clues in that area, just as one example.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, David. Let me finish off with the question. I was involved with a workshop with FDA. It was multidisciplinary, and people from industry, regulators, academics, etc. And there's a paper coming out in Clinical Pharmacology Therapeutics on that workshop. So there were many aspects discussed in terms of how you get elderly people into trials, participate in trials, and many of the roadblocks you've already mentioned in your first couple of slides. One of the areas was that, so if you take parallels with the pediatric drug development, there were incentives which were then introduced by the FDA, the EMA, etc., for undertaking pediatric drug development, the PIPs and so on. Do you think that this was one aspect which was discussed? Do you think that there should be less an elderly investigation plan or multimorbidity investigation plan with incentives which might help in terms of developing these medicines, but also take into account the polypharmacy that abounds in our elderly population?
Great question on there. I mean, from industry, I would say, wouldn't I? Incentive programs be welcomed. I think we need to make sure we don't over-bureaucratize it. I think there's a lot of advantages we've seen through the pediatric program, but perhaps it needed a bit more refinement and drive it. I think here we've got to ask, what's the right thing to do? Because there is the marketing, there is an element of a market here. So I think it's going to be a slightly different approach, but I'm sure you're right. But I think some of this remote monitoring, I think taking some of the burdens out of the trials as well, I think this may be a way forward. Because I think people want to be involved, but I think it's more not just about incentives. I think there is an incentive there already. I think actually it's about how we get the enablers in place. And that is a very frank conversation. How can we make it easier to collect the data from people? How can we have different settings to collect it and so on? I think that is a great conversation, but I think there are many factors involved. Yes, incentives might play a part in there, but we might have to segment that given money is rather short, to be honest.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, everybody, for going to your breakout rooms, and hopefully you had a good conversation. It'd be good to hear about conversations in different breakout groups. Each breakout group had a chair and a rapporteur. So I'll start off with group one, which I was in that group one, and ably chaired by Eddie Blair, and Charlotte Summers was the rapporteur. So I'll hand over to you, Charlotte, to report, and then Eddie, if there's anything else you want to add.
Thank you, Munir. So our question to address was, how do we make progress in long COVID in the presence of such uncertainty? And so one of the things that we thought is that there are several areas that we probably need to address research-wise. Firstly, there's some questions outstanding around the impact of different variants and viral loads on the impact of long COVID. But also we felt that we need better ways of stratifying and impacting kind of patient characteristics, their comorbidities, and so the combination, I guess, of their genome and their exposome on the development of long COVID. And we thought to do that, we probably need a combination of things, including access to patient and samples, but also better tools for both diagnosis and prognosis. But critically, to get any progress, we thought that there needs to be integration between the healthcare delivery system and all types of researchers, so from preclinical through to phase 3, both academic and commercial, because at the moment there's a gap if you're particularly in the commercial sector and you've got an early phase asset that you think might be appropriate for a particular setting in long COVID, trying to find who to talk to and where to make those links is challenging. And then finally, I think we were keen to see that there were support for all stages of research, that it is going to take an entire pipeline and a multidisciplinary approach to improving outcomes in long COVID, and not just the development of pharmacotherapy. We need a broader, more holistic approach to interventions that might help.
Great, thank you very much. It's a great summary. Eddie, is there anything you want to add?
No, I think that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you, Charlotte. Two things that I just mentioned is to name check Paul, because we did talk about imaging as one of those diagnostic tools that might help with managing long COVID. And then there was quite a long discussion just to make Kieran aware about how we think there might be a place for patient education or patient helper education as part of the GP funded education piece around long COVID. But other than that, I think I'd just like to thank all the participants for making my job as chair very easy, and particularly to Charlotte for summarising so well.
Thanks, Eddie. Kieran isn't online, but I'll email her and let her know about our discussions.
Thanks, Munir. Great.
Any questions or comments from anybody? Any questions you want to ask? So one of the aspects we did talk about was about brain imaging, and so some of the sort of images you showed, Paul, this morning were quite striking. The PET scan, the hypermetabolism, etc. And obviously these are in small numbers that you've undertaken this because it's an expensive technique. Do you know there's many more studies going on to be able to understand what the hypermetabolism actually means, whether it's reversible, whether sort of there is long-term consequences of that?
There's not that many studies in the UK. There's some studies in US being funded as a part of the FOSP. There is some of the patients are being followed up. Again, a handful of or probably a couple of hundred patients. But there's not a huge amount of study happening at this moment, as far as I gather.
And the hypometabolism that occurs, do you think that's going to be reversible?
So I think some of the data coming, and so immediately, probably after 1 month or so after the event, we see some hypermetabolism, and by 6 months, there's some amount is reversible. So I would imagine people with the persistent symptoms are the ones who are having the persistent hypometabolism. The people who are recovering probably are compensating in some ways and getting back to. In the acute phase, which I didn't show, is you also see hypermetabolism. That's probably secondary to the encephalitis or meningitis happening and glial activation and the glucose metabolism going up as a reactive phenomenon. But just to highlight that. But predominantly what we were more worried about is the hypometabolism, and especially if it is persisting.
Okay, thank you. Before we go on to group 2, maybe Charlotte, I don't know whether you want to mention some of the issues you think are there in terms of linking up different studies, different biobanks and so on, some of the governance issues you talked about.
Yes, of course. So one of the key things that I think would probably help in the longer term is that there are lots of discrete data sets and studies, both of biosamples, but also clinical data and trial data, that at the moment regulations make it challenging to join all of those up. There were some discussions around all of the platform studies actually down the line linking, but with the health data concerns that have been in the press recently, all of that has got a little bit harder. And so some coordinated fashion by which, if you happened to be in the principal trial to try and keep you out of hospital, but ended up in hospital and taking part in recovery and then joining FOSP and genomic, being able to look at all of those different aspects of your illness where there's data and your routine health data would be tremendously informative to help us understand more about this disease. But at the moment, the regulations are proving challenging.
Okay, and what's the solution to that, Charlotte?
The solution to that, I think, is probably across regulators, NIHR and HDR UK, finding a way to communicate effectively with the public that this is something that's helpful. I think that's where it went a little bit awry the other week, and that there are positive things that come out of this, that it's not about their data just being sold for commercial purposes, and that there's a real pressing need, and then the regulatory hurdles being taken out of the way because they're stopping progress in healthcare.
Okay, thanks very much, Charlotte. Any comments from anybody before I move on to group 2? Okay, I don't see any hands up. So let's move to group 2. Paul, you chaired it. I don't know who your rapporteur was.
Emmy. Sorry, Emmy.
Hi, Paul. Yeah, so we spoke about how we understand individual predisposition to long COVID. We spent an amount of time talking about the still challenges in defining long COVID beyond hospitalized and non-hospitalized, the challenges of the clustering of symptoms and how that relates to dysfunction and so on, and that is tied to how or whether people are predisposed to it, because we need to define the disease first. We in terms of predisposing factors, one of our colleagues mentioned that there's already a review, I think by NICE, which has identified some factors which are now well documented: female gender, obesity, asthma, which seem to be related to a higher risk of persistent symptoms. But beyond that, we identified 2 areas where more results are expected and more work is to be done. One is in Charlotte was alluding to the linkage with NHS data that in existing platform trials and one of the core funded studies, convalescence, as well as looking at linked data in the NHS going backwards. But also there are cohort studies in that convalescent study where you can compare with pre-pandemic population, because that's a big question, is knowing people's pre-pandemic or pre-COVID comorbidities to compare what the risk factors are. So those discussions about disease definition and definition of premorbid or conditions or comorbid conditions meant that we're still quite far from stratifying. If I was to summarize this, some good news in terms of organ-specific effects where imaging and other modalities may help, and as long as that's linked with the premorbid data. And we spoke particularly about lung fibrosis, about myocarditis, pericarditis, and also about neurological or brain imaging findings, but in relation to brain fog. But yeah, when finally we spent some time talking about biomarkers and the potential role of omics, and do chip in other members of the group, but I think we felt that we need to do the rest first before we get to the stage where omics is going to inform us. We can't do omics without better disease definition and better definition of the premorbid conditions.
Okay, thank you very much, Ami. Paul?
Yeah, Ami covered everything. Probably I myself threw a question that, can we carry on doing the omics and imaging and stuff for the next 5 years where the patients are knocking at your door and say, we want treatment. So it's sort of that's the challenge we are facing. Yeah, we had a very good discussion over the period. There's nothing else to add.
Yes, that is a challenge, isn't it? Because if patients are knocking on your door for treatment, do you resist saying we don't know and we don't want to give you anything to do, or do you start giving them the kind of hydroxychloroquine type of things that happened in COVID-19 at the beginning of the pandemic? So I think that is a challenge.
And it's also a fine balance, because if we are the patient or if we are the receiving end, we would like some treatment. So it's quite a tricky one.
It is, yes, very much so. Any comments from anybody in the group or anybody in the workshop today? So I think in terms of your omics point, I guess what we need to think about is that samples should be collected and biobanked and archived with linkage to clinical data, so that as we get more information, more knowledge, better knowledge, then whereby we can actually stratify clinically, then that allows us to be able to utilize the samples which are available. Because the problem is that if we only collect samples later on, we may not have enough of a sample size to be able to look at some of the potential genetic predictors or other biomarkers.
I fully agree with that. We're thinking about this in our own study about how much to biobank and how much to analyze and process, and we think definitely we should be biobanking and as many people as we can consent to it. But in the first instance, we need to come up with the right questions to do the tests.
But in a study like yours, where you've got to have very deep phenotyping with some of the imaging that you're doing and so on, it would be a shame not to have the biobank that you can look at later on, should you know?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, great. Any questions or comments on that one? Okay, well, let's move to group 3. What can we learn from long COVID that we can apply to other diseases? So Shuli, I think you were chairing. I don't know who was.
Yeah, and Belen's going to feed back on.
Okay.
Yes.
The group.
Thank you, Shuli. Okay, so we were talking about 3 main areas. So one is about robustness of data. How do we apply the effects of long-term COVID to other diseases? And the fact also that it's still very early days to draw any firm conclusions. So starting by the last one, so we were talking about, for example, comparing, like in terms of the long-term COVID, it could be shorter or longer. So for instance, in the case of rheumatoid arthritis, you will have different effects if you were to treat this disease in 3 months compared to 6 months. So it's something to bear in mind about this. Then also we discussed the fact that we need to involve patients in clinical trials, and also that we need to look at different groups of ages. On this respect, we know that, okay, so COVID-19 affects predominantly to elderly people, but we must not ignore the pediatrics population because they also suffer from long-term COVID. And by ignoring this group, perhaps we could be jeopardizing their longevity in the long term. Then about the long COVID in applying the findings to other diseases, we were talking about the factors. So for instance, we know that COVID-19 causes multi-organ disease, but this is due to just the one factor, and that is the virus, the COVID-19. However, we were also talking about lupus, which is a multifactorial disease also causing a multi-organ disease. We discussed the clusters, identifying clusters of disease, and then how do we define the disease activity and the targets. We mentioned that, for instance, precision medicine can be useful, but let's not ignore medicines that have a broader action, and that can also be very useful. We also need to agree on the endpoints, and then we need better outcome measures to treat symptoms outside the COVID. So for instance, people with myalgia, fibromyalgia, chronic bowel disease, mental fog, like all these areas. This group of patients, they've been looking for solutions, and it is now that with the conclusions that we are drawing from the COVID-19 that we can apply the findings to this group of patients. And then we were also talking about the robustness of data. So how are we going to put all this data into a pot? And how can we ensure that is robust? Because yes, there is a lot of information out there. However, it may not be that reliable, and we need to identify as well cohorts and the size of these areas of study. So I think that is about it. I don't know if Shuli wants to add anything else.
Okay, Shuli.
Thank you, Belen, and thank you to the group. I think hearing the other 2 groups, the sort of the overlapping themes were definitely this robustness of data and linking data sets and really trying to get the full picture. And then the other thing that came across was this learning, really understanding what's going on in the disease, because if we don't really understand the pathophysiology and however we define endpoints, we may be sort of heading off in the wrong direction. So there was a theme about it takes time, and I think that sort of dovetails with what the other groups were saying of, yes, we've done a lot in a short time, but things will take more time still to get that depth of understanding that we need. So thank you. Thanks, Glenn. Thanks to the group.
Any questions for Shirley or Belen? Can I ask one of the things that?
Quick comment, Munir. Brian here.
So can you hear me? Yes, go ahead, please, Brian.
Yeah, just that thread of the immunoinflammatory angle seems to be running through this quite a lot in everyone's comments, and the allusion to the lupus situation, which is multi-organic and along that way, may also be relevant. Sorry, just to draw attention to it.
Yeah. So I was going to ask Brian in a few minutes for you to be able to give a perspective from the ABPI in terms of today's. So I'll pre-warn you for that. Then I'll bring you back in a few minutes, if that's okay. So Mark, you've got a question or comment?
Yeah, I was just sort of the devil's advocate in the group as a rheumatologist, just trying to, express some caution about over connecting this to lupus. There are some real differences, and there are other diseases with multi-organ pathology that we should also look at. And I mentioned AIDS or HIV is one of them. That's kind of an interesting one, and there are other diseases, that's sarcoidosis and lots of other kind of multi-organ diseases that we should look at. I would caution at sort of just connecting it with lupus, because lupus is a very different beast sometimes, but there are some lessons to be learned from our experience with lupus, which is that it was very, very difficult to get drugs licensed for lupus. And there are a lot of lessons from the trial, the experience that we had in lupus, that the long COVID community should look at. They should sort of try and sort of talk to the lupus world to see what lessons they learned from their bad experiences, not just their good experiences. That's what I would say.
So thanks very much for that, Mark, and you may want to come into this question as well, and Shirley as well. One of the overlaps between long COVID, at least some aspects of long COVID, and other diseases with chronic fatigue syndrome, which we've known about for a long time. The sort of fatigue, other manifestations, including the kind of lack of concentration and things like that. But we haven't learned very much of that, and there's still a lot of controversy. For example, some guidelines which are coming out from the Royal College, which were going to advocate the use of physical therapies, etc., were are quite controversial, have been held back at the moment, because patients feel that just going for rehabilitation is not the answer for chronic fatigue syndrome, and there may be other things going on. And Kieran Collinson highlighted the need for rehabilitation in long COVID, which may not be particularly well received by patients, in terms of saying, well, actually, you're just telling us to go and do a bit of physio, and that is not going to help us very much. So I know, Shirley, whether you discussed that as part of what we can learn long COVID and CFS particularly.
Yeah, we talked about, we started with thinking about patient and public involvement, and we're very pleased to see the example that the what had happened in HEAL and what Charlotte talked about this morning, and saying actually the way that that's been done of defining endpoints and bringing patients and public into the design of that study is a really, really nice example. But yes, then that led on to the question of, okay, if we're putting so much attention onto long COVID, including symptoms such as brain fog and symptoms that in other contexts have not necessarily had the impact in terms of treatments that patients would want, actually, what does that then mean for those patients? And how do we make sure that if we do have relevant scientific or medical, treatment breakthroughs from a long COVID perspective, that we translate them across to those other diseases. So yeah, we did talk about the fact that the patient perspective could be, hang on, if it was labelled long COVID, I'd be getting all this care and, you know, potentially treatments down the line, but because it's labelled something else, is that not getting the same attention?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a really important point, because I've had lots of referrals to my clinic for patients who suffering from fluoroquinolone disability syndrome, you know, which is now recognized by the FDA as a particular adverse effect of fluoroquinolones, which is associated with these kind of fatigue, brain fog, etc. And they're saying, well, there's so much effort going into long COVID, and everybody's forgotten about us, and so on. So, you know, I think there is that issue there. Philippa, you've got your hand up, and then Eddie.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I think it's partly been addressed, but it seemed to me just listening to this, a lot of this is about dealing with uncertainty, partly in understanding disease and also in communication to health professionals and to the public. And then also it seems the answer to the uncertainty is in driving the research, which requires public engagement and confidence about supporting data sharing and research. I suppose I mean, since long COVID does COVID grabs the attention more than other conditions, which, as we've seen, is a problem as well as a good thing. Is there still scope to capitalise on the sort of public awareness of long COVID to help try and solve some of these healthcare data sharing issues?
Yeah, I think that is correct, and I think people are trying to do that. HDI UK, I know NHS has got a big engagement program going ahead, you know, because without data, we wouldn't be where we are now in terms of fighting long COVID. Fighting COVID itself, actually, you know, and the data that comes through for showing vaccine effectiveness, etc., is all data that is, you know, that is anonymized, pseudo-anonymized, etc., for us to be able to use it. If we didn't have access to that data, we would be nowhere in terms of knowing whether everything was working. So yeah, absolutely, very important point. Eddie.
Just a comment to add to what you're saying about related disease, Maria. I think post-sepsis syndrome is a very obvious link to long COVID as well. So that was just a comment. And then the other comment is just to follow up on what Sheila was saying about learning. The learning experience, kind of what Pippa was saying, needs to translate into education, dissemination, and better communication of benefits of participating. So I think that came up in the feedback from our group. I just wanted to emphasise that as something that we felt quite strongly about.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks very much, Eddie. Any final comments on any of the three groups? If not, maybe I should then, Tracy. You're on mute, Tracy. You're on mute.
What have we learned from the chronic fatigue syndrome? You going back to your point and not being very tractable. I think from my experience working in that community quite a lot, I've seen it seems there are different causes for the same condition, many different causes, and it's individual to each person. And therefore, you know, is there a different model that's needed to tackle that at a very individual level? That's really all my point.
Absolutely, and I absolutely agree. You know, we can try to treat the population, but actually, in the end, it comes down to the individual. When I see a patient in my clinic, it's a person sitting in front of me that I have to really try to treat. Yeah, absolutely. David.
Yes, and just following on from that, I think, you know, looking back over my career in clinical medicine, you think of things like idiopathic cardiomyopathy, all the work that was done, or with Harry Keane did, around inflammation of the pancreas, the ileocytis there, and leading to diabetes. I think there are a number of areas there where COVID-19 has shone the spotlight on them again. I think there'll be new focus on those, and I think there are a lot of learnings. So I think this will go more widely, but certainly I think all that we saw in cardiomyopathy will need us to look again and see, you know, should we be intervening early in some of those viral infections to prevent this and so on?
Okay, yeah, thank you. Okay, if no more points or comments, Brian, maybe I can ask you to say a few words about what you found from the workshop. Why is this important for ABPI? And some of the sort of, we haven't discussed what the long-term action plan should be from this workshop. And then, we may need to meet up afterwards, but then I can close the workshop.
Yes, great. Thank you very much, Munir. It's been incredibly informative to me. I think the set of presentations that you put together were really brilliant and pretty well up to the minute. And I certainly learned a lot, and I hope that the sharing of it amongst the community here has helped as well. I think another reflection is that when we talked about designing this 6 months ago or so, we clearly knew there was a lot moving quite quickly, and there's still a lot moving quite quickly. And I hope that the topics that we picked on were still relevant. I think they were from the outputs from the groups. I do think it's kind of still early days. I think there's an awful lot of research happening, and we're trying to sort of second guess stuff a bit when we had our discussions. There's an urgency here that people want to do something. I think some of these trials, you need to run the course and see what the results are before you rush off into the next thing. It would be a reflection. I think there are some learnings from other disease areas, but Mark's caution not to pin everything on one comparator is important. I do think that thread of immunology and inflammation that we're learning about in all sorts of other disease areas is key to this. And we're learning more about that in other disease areas as well as this one. And the more we can bring those together, I think is going to be important as we go forward. And the last point, I think, and it really was highlighted, you've said it already, but I'll say it again, the way that we corral data during COVID under the COPI notices really highlighted the value of being able to pull health data for a specific purpose in what was an emergency. And the more we can do that in a safe environment going forward without sort of falling back to the previous situation, the better from a research viewpoint. I think there are challenges clearly with the issues around making sure we take the public with us and engage the public and the patients before we make announcements on things or try and implement things is clear, and we will be hoping to get more involved in that from a public viewpoint going forward across the board, not just for COVID and long COVID. I do think it would be good to reflect on how this workshop's gone, Munir, and see whether we should be taking forward anything specific from this group, and maybe, if nothing else, convening a rerun in a few months' time and seeing whether some of these results of trials that are ongoing are out, and whether we can reflect on anything more specific and more definitive conclusions about the pathophysiology of long COVID, the variety of that, and what you can do about it. So I think that's a reflection from the ABPI. It's fairly general at the moment. We wouldn't be talking about anything specific company-wise or drug-wise, but clearly the industry is keen to be involved in the discussion and wants to help take this forward and help address it going forward. And I think for COVID and long COVID, we should be looking at having therapeutics as well as vaccines. We're going to be working with this for a long time, and that's going to be a good mix if we can get there.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian. That's great. So thank you. So I think what I want to do is just close the workshop. Normally, what we try to do at the end of these workshops is produce a paper, which can then be published, but none of us has any time at the moment to write papers, really, with everything going on. But what we may do is to write, an A4 page with some bullet points, which highlight some of the recommendations from this. And so, Brian, maybe what we can link up after this workshop and see what those particular recommendations would be. It may be very generic recommendations about data linkages, sorting out the governance issues, having biobankings that, which is linked to data, allows more mechanistic assessments, being able to link up to the NHS clinics so that commercial companies as well as academics can access patients and things like that. So there may be some generic issues which recommendations we can make from this as an output from the workshop, and pass on to our colleagues at NIHR, at NHS, UKRI, and various other bodies, including sort of, whoever you need to within ABPI. So I think that may be one of the sort of things that comes out of it as an action plan. But maybe what we can do, Brian, is to link up, after the workshop in a couple of week or two, and see how we want to take that forward, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so I think that's the end of the workshop. First of all, let me thank the speakers. Fantastic talks from all the speakers. Really, really insightful, really up to date. And I learned a lot about long COVID today. So it's really, really helpful. Rather than reading journals, etc., it's been much easier to actually listen to you and learn a lot about what's going on with long COVID. To the chairs and rapporteurs for the breakout groups, thank you very much for your help. You were corralled at short notice to do this, and you did that brilliantly. Thank you. And obviously all the participants who came to the workshop and contributed today. Thank you very much. Great to see all of you, and see you at the next workshop. Thank you, and have a way. I would normally say have a safe trip back home, but you're probably at home, so have a nice cup of tea or something. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Veneer. Bye.
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 Thank you. Bye.
Okay, Nathan. Thanks very much, Mark.
Just while you're on, Veneer, we'd spoken about arranging a steering committee meeting to coincide with the open meeting next month. Mm-hmm. But some of the steering committee aren't going to be there in person. Some are attending remotely.
So why don't we hold the steering committee at some other time then?
Yeah. I was wondering about maybe doing it the month after, when we can talk about how the meeting went and plans for next things.
Yeah, that's
okay.
Fine.
I'll get in touch with Sam and find a date.
Okay. Great. So thanks very much. So I think that went okay, even despite the small number. It was disappointing to have a small number, but never mind. But I think they were all engaged and so on. So that was good. But I think what we need to think about is, for the main meeting, how can we actually drum up some enthusiasm so that we make sure that people attend for the annual meeting. So I think we're going to have to, so that's why I wanted that update on numbers coming through, so I can be proactive and get other people to be proactive to get people coming to this meeting. So if you can let me have those updates, I may have to contact the steering committee saying, can you please drum up support for this meeting? We need to make sure that we've got enough people coming to the annual meeting. How many people are registered at the moment?
We've got about 50
altogether.
Yeah,
virtual and face to face.
Yeah,
that's not very many, is it?
No. The first week in September, we had a rash of new registrations.
Right.
So I was expecting we would see that building up, throughout the month, but then it's gone quiet again.
Okay, so can you put out some more adverts, please, for that, if you don't mind?
Sure, of course. I've made some new videos with the speakers' pictures in and session titles, and I've been putting them out on LinkedIn and Twitter. But yeah, absolutely, I'll continue with that.
Maybe talk to Christine. How did she manage to get people coming in and so on? I'm sure but is there anything that we're missing? Is there a trick we're missing and so on?
Yeah, absolutely. It's worth asking. I think one of Christine's tricks was just ignoring GDPR, and I'm not sure I'm going to go down that route. But one of the things that, of course, we're not getting.
People have registered for our meeting before, and so on, and we can use that data to be able to, get back to them.
Yeah, that's right. The one thing that we're missing now, and this is where Christine was really key, is she got a lot of people signing up from other meetings that she attended, and she would speak to people and they would sign up after speaking to her. Quite often when people signed up, they would say it was because they'd met Christine at a meeting, and obviously meetings it's not like that, so But I was in touch with Christine yesterday, and she felt from people that she'd spoken to that people are planning to attend but haven't decided yet whether they want to be in person or virtual, so they're hanging on before they sign.
But
So
personalized emails to the whole every member of the UK Pharmacogenetics group, or plus any of the lists you have, keep on bombarding them with emails and so on.
Will do.
All right, sorry, but I just it'd be embarrassing if we only have 50 people there.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. I feel I do feel a responsibility to get people there. So yeah, I'll continue with that.
Great. Thanks very much.
Okay. Speak to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.